Here in this house, up these stairs, is a newlywed couple fast asleep. It is late in the night or early in the morning, depending on how you want to look at it. As this man lays with his much younger wife, he is calm and relaxed in their affluence that he provides, and is stress-free after finally finalizing the divorce from his previous wife, a much older woman, a woman who'd been causing him and his new bride nothing but trouble. But what this resting couple doesn't know is that downstairs, someone has broken into their home. Although roaming around, ironically, this intruder isn't here to steal anything, but this intruder is very furious. As they quietly head up the stairs towards their sleeping targets, thoughts of betrayal, vengeance, and revenge begin to zoom through their mind. Their anger only enhances as they get closer to the top of the stairs. They see the couple in bed, sleeping comfortably together, and complete fury takes over. This intruder reaches into their bag, and the glimmering light from a gun cascades across the room. Soon, one of them, lying in bed, moves, and this night ends with 2 deceased people and the intruder in handcuffs. But my question to you is, was this intruder wrong? To many, she is just a ruthless killer. To some others, she's actually seen as a hero for angry and scorned women everywhere, for women who have helped build their men from the ground up, only for that same man to betray them and give the perks of their hard work to a much younger, more beautiful woman. Betty is a saint. For women who have been cheated on after giving their all to a toxic relationship or unrequited love, Betty only did what they wished they had the tatas to do. Crimes of passion will always be a very sensitive subject because it draws a thin line of villain or victim when it comes to the perpetrator. Also, so many champion and identify with women like Betty because they know what that kind of hurt and betrayal feels like. But what am I talking about here? The life and crime of Betty Broderick and the incident that caused her to go down a very dark past. Born Elizabeth Ann Bishiglia on November 7, 1947 in Brooklyn, New York, Betty grew up in a large Irish Catholic family. The third of 6 children, Betty grew up in a conservative, devoutly religious household where her parents instilled traditional values of family, marriage, and respectability. Her father was a successful businessman running a plastering company, and her mother, a homemaker, expected Betty to follow a similar path of marriage, children, and the role of a devoted wife. From a young age, Betty was told that her primary goal in life should be to find a good husband, raise children, and build a home. Society never saw much for the goals of women back then. It was a man's world, and the woman was supposed to be there to back him up. This type of thought process would come to bite her later on. After attending an all-girls Catholic high school, she pursued a degree in early childhood education and later received a teaching certificate. Despite her academic achievements, her ambitions remained firmly tied to the societal expectations of the time. And luckily for her, at least at the time, it was within this framework that she met Dan Broderick. Betty met Daniel Broderick III, a medical student at the University of Notre Dame, in 1965. Just like Betty, Dan was the son of a well-to-do Catholic family and had an ambitious future ahead of him. What she considered to be tall, charming, and brilliant, he made an immediate impression on Betty. The couple quickly became serious, with Dan supposedly asking Betty to marry him every single day for 3 years straight. Finally, she gave in, and the two married on April 12, 1969. In a traditional Catholic ceremony, Dan was a hard-driving individual who, even early on, showed signs of his relentless ambition and determination to get ahead in life. After their wedding, he continued his education, pursuing both medical and law degrees at Harvard, with Betty supporting him financially by working multiple jobs. Even with all her help and support, Dan even admitted to not being the best husband at the time. He admitted to being solely work-focused and an overachiever, oftentimes neglecting his wife, who by now had a couple of children. During an interview he did in the San Diego Reader in June of 1988, he acknowledged that Betty became very unhappy early into their marriage. He stated their marriage was just weeks old when she asked him for a divorce for the first time, and their relationship only grew more toxic as the years rolled by. Here's what he said. On a regular basis, she expressed extreme unhappiness with me and my dedication to my work and my profession and my attitude toward her and our children. There were requests, demands for divorce hundreds of times. I mean hundreds of times. I'm not exaggerating. Even though he recognized and stated that they had real incompatibility problems, he also admitted to his detrimental role that he played in their marital issues. He said, "I was far from the kind of good, loving husband I could have been." According to Betty's daughter, Kim, Betty would become so angry with Dan all the time. She even once threw a stereo at him and would frequently lock him out of the house. But still, in the early years of their marriage, Betty played the role of the quintessential supportive wife, helping Dan through school while raising their children. By 1975, Dan had completed his degrees, and the couple moved to La Jolla, California, where Dan began practicing law. They eventually had 4 children, and their life appeared picture perfect. They purchased a beautiful home, and Dan's legal career soared as he specialized in medical malpractice, becoming one of the most successful attorneys in San Diego. The Brodericks became a part of the local elite, moving in affluent social circles. To the outside world, Betty and Dan Broderick seemed to have it all: money, status, a beautiful family, and a successful marriage. However, behind closed doors, tension simmered. Dan's demanding career and his growing ego created distance in the marriage. Betty began feeling increasingly isolated and unappreciated after years of devoting herself to her husband and children. Her role in their success was not publicly acknowledged, and as Dan grew more powerful and wealthy, Betty felt sidelined, as if that wasn't enough. Things would only get worse. The year 1983 came, and this is when Betty's life, as she knew it, came to an end. In a 1990 interview, Betty said, "The people who knew me before 1983 knew the real me. 1983 was like an axe through my life." It was 1983 that everything came crashing down when Dan hired 21-year-old Linda Kolkina, a receptionist, to work in his office. Although immediately Betty suspected an affair between Dan and Linda, but she wasn't threatened at first. Here's what she said about their possible affair at the time. She said, "This was just a phase, a bad time, too stupid to be true," she wrote of their marriage. "That girl had nothing on me. I am prettier, smarter, classier. She is a dumb, uneducated tramp with no background or education or talent. He'll definitely get over it." But that self-assuredness would soon change. When she'd confront Dan about his infidelity, he vehemently denied it, gaslit her, and made her feel like she was crazy. But as the months wore on, Betty became consumed by her suspicions. Her fears were confirmed in 1985 when Dan left her and moved into a separate house, openly pursuing a relationship with Linda, humiliating Betty in the process. Those affluent circles that she'd been accustomed to were seeing her popular husband parading around his new, much younger and prettier love. What made this worse is that many compared the two ladies and saw Linda as a young version of Betty. Betty's world unraveled. She saw Dan's betrayal as him going through an obvious midlife crisis. Here's what she told the San Diego Reader in an interview she did with them. "He literally walked out 3 months after his 40th birthday party and with a red Corvette and a 21-year-old. Are we the American joke or not? If you weren't my husband, I'd think you were real funny. He's got a scarf around his neck, and he wanted those Ray-Ban sunglasses from Risky Business. I said, you're it. You are the cover of Midlife Crisis magazine. Cool, Dan, cool." Her anger turned to obsession as Dan continued to proudly exert control over their separation, ultimately gaining custody of the children and using his legal prowess to delay the divorce process. Betty felt that Dan had stripped her of everything: her children, her financial security, her self-worth, and her youth. She accused him of manipulating the legal system and using his wealth to keep her in a vulnerable position, and Linda was no better. According to Betty, Linda taunted her with pics of Dan and an anonymous note that read, "Eat your heart out, bitch." She also claimed that Linda sent her ads for weight loss products and wrinkle cream and even refused to hand over her wedding china. What followed was one of the most bitter and publicized divorces in American history. For Betty, the legal process was agonizing and humiliating. Dan, who now had a high-profile relationship with Linda, appeared to live a carefree life while she struggled. Even though he bought Betty a beautiful home for $650,000 and paid her $16,000 a month, she still kept harassing him, constantly breaking into his home to burn his clothes, smearing pie all over his kitchen and spray painting his walls, and ignoring all the restraining orders against her. Dan took away money for every cuss word she said to him. Eventually completely fed up with Betty's antics, he stopped paying her anything. He sold their shared properties, refused her requests for alimony, and dismissed her from his life with indifference. The divorce was finalized in 1989 after a grueling 5-year battle, with Dan awarded custody of their children. Betty, of course, did not go away quietly. She continued to harass Dan, leaving angry, expletive-filled messages on his answering machine, vandalizing his new home, and even driving her car into his front door at one point. Despite court orders for her to cease contact, Betty's fury grew uncontrollable. Even though Dan had had Betty arrested for her crimes towards him, as well as put away in a mental institution, none of this stopped her. By the time Dan and Linda got married in April of 1989, Linda was so afraid for their safety that she wanted Dan to wear a bulletproof vest, and they had security there. Linda had every reason to be scared because what she didn't know is that Betty had actually bought a gun. Socially and emotionally, it was really over for Betty at that point. She felt trapped in a world where her sacrifices were rendered meaningless, and her once perfect life had been taken from her, and as far as she'd gone before, soon she was going to go further and would not be able to return. On November 5th, 1989, just 2 days before Betty's 42nd birthday, the situation reached its tragic climax. Betty, unable to move past her anger and feeling utterly betrayed, not only by Dan but by her own children, who were very happy living with their father, and angry at her for all the chaos she was causing, stole her daughter's copy of Dan's house keys. Betty entered Dan and Linda's home early in the wee hours of the morning. Armed with a revolver, she snuck into their room. Feeling her intrusive presence there, Linda woke up and screamed, "Call the police!" As she screamed out, Betty popped Linda twice, one in the head and one in the chest, deleting her instantly. Dan, who was reaching for the phone, got popped in the chest, but he didn't pass right away. Betty went over to his phone and ripped it out the wall so that he couldn't call for help. Betty claims that Dan gurgled out the words, "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." He was 44 and Linda was 28 and had only been married for 7 months before their tragic end. Betty fled the scene, eventually calling her daughter to confess to the killings, and she turned herself in. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the country and cemented the Broderick divorce as one of the most notorious and tragic domestic battles in American legal history. Betty Broderick's trial in 1991 became a media sensation. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who couldn't move on from her divorce, while Betty's defense portrayed her as a mentally and emotionally abused woman driven to the breaking point by her ex-husband's manipulations. Betty's supporters believed she was a victim of the system, abandoned by her husband and betrayed by a legal system that favored the powerful. The first trial ended in a hung jury, with many jurors unable to reconcile whether Betty had acted in premeditation or in a moment of emotional insanity. However, in a retrial later that year, Betty was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. Betty Broderick's story continues to fascinate and polarize the public. To some, she is the archetypal scorned woman, driven to violence by years of emotional abuse, neglect, and betrayal. To others, she is a cold and calculating murderer who refused to accept the end of her marriage and sought revenge in the most horrific way possible. Her case sparked conversations about gender dynamics, power in marriages, and the impact of the legal system on divorce and custody battles. Was Betty a victim of the patriarchy, manipulated by a powerful man, or was she an obsessive woman, unable to control her rage? In other words, was she wrong? Betty Broderick remains in prison to this day, repeatedly denied parole for failing to show remorse for the murders of Dan and Linda. In countless interviews, she has maintained that her actions were a product of the unrelenting abuse and manipulation she endured. Whether seen as a victim or villain, Betty Broderick's story serves as a grim reminder of how deeply love, power, and betrayal can intertwine and unravel in devastating ways. So, lurkers, what do you think? Even though this case was tragic, do you think Betty was wrong? Do you think she could have actually moved on to have a better life? Do you think that Dan was actually the villain in this story? Let me know your takes down below.